Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of the most hilariously bizarre sides of human history. The things people truly, genuinely believed during the Middle Ages. From sneezing out demons, to toads growing inside stomachs, this was an era full of superstition, weird science, and flat-out nonsense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. 1. Womb wanderers, when they thought the uterus could roam the body. Imagine waking up with a cough in the 1300s, and your doctor tells you it's because your uterus is in your throat. Yes, medieval physicians believed in wandering womb syndrome, a condition where the uterus, believed to be an independent, mobile creature, could travel around a woman's body, causing havoc wherever it landed. If you had trouble breathing, clearly, the womb had floated upward. Pain in your leg. The womb was down there stretching out. And the treatments. They'd wave sweet-smelling herbs around the woman's head to lure the womb back down. Or worse, they'd place foul-smelling rags near her feet to drive it away. This belief wasn't just niche, it stuck around for centuries. Even Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen helped lay the groundwork for this theory. It shows how science, without evidence, can be swayed entirely by imagination. It also reminds us how women's bodies were misunderstood, feared, and pathologized in the strangest ways. But the idea of an organ going on a solo adventure? That's medieval logic for you. Unhinged and oddly poetic. 2. Sneezing out demons, the origins of bless you. In the Middle Ages, a simple sneeze wasn't just a sneeze. It was a cosmic event. People believed that when you sneezed, your soul might momentarily leave your body, or worse, that evil spirits could enter you during that vulnerable split second. Some even thought sneezing was your body's desperate attempt to expel demons that had taken residence inside your lungs or brain. This fear wasn't just cultural, it was backed by religious leaders. They claimed sneezing could be a sign of impending death, especially during times of plague. It wasn't rare for someone to sneeze and be met with a chorus of "God bless you" from every direction. But it wasn't just polite manners, it was an act of spiritual defense. Pope Gregory I is often credited with popularizing the phrase during the 6th century plague in Rome. He ordered people to bless anyone who sneezed because it could be the first sign they were falling ill, and possibly marked by death. Others believed that the heart stopped briefly when you sneezed, and that blessing the sneezer was a way of protecting their soul during the interruption. While this isn't physiologically accurate, it certainly fed into the mystique of the moment. To make it stranger, there were also some folk remedies to prevent demons from entering during a sneeze. People would wear amulets, cover their mouths with religious symbols, or even pray before sneezing if they felt it coming. It all adds up to a period in history where human biology was wrapped tightly with spiritual panic. In a world without germ theory, everything had deeper meaning, even mucus. 3. Toads in women's stomachs? Yeah, they believed that. One of the strangest and most unsettling beliefs during the Middle Ages involved women and toads. Yes, actual toads. According to medical texts and folklore passed around Europe, it was widely believed that toads could somehow live inside a woman's body, specifically her stomach or womb. The belief wasn't that she ate one or swallowed one in her sleep. No. They believed the toad had magically or supernaturally entered her body, possibly through drinking water or even bad air, and then made a home inside her internal organs. These phantom toads were often blamed for a wide range of symptoms: stomach pain, swelling, infertility, mood swings, convulsions, and even demonic possession. If a woman suffered from an illness that couldn't be explained by the primitive medicine of the day, the diagnosis might be, "There's probably a toad living in her." And that diagnosis came with treatments that were as insane as the diagnosis itself. One such remedy included tying a live toad to a woman's stomach in hopes that the internal toad would be attracted to its external cousin and try to exit. Yes, that was real. Another approach involved strange potions made with herbs and animal parts meant to dislodge the amphibious intruder. And sometimes, women were subjected to religious rituals designed to expel the toad, as if it were a demon. But this belief wasn't just fringe nonsense. Many midwives and even trained male physicians accepted it as medical truth. In fact, toads had long been associated with witchcraft and evil. Their presence symbolized poison, secrecy, and sin. So it wasn't hard for the medieval mind to leap from bad symptoms to must be a toad. What makes this even darker is how this belief was used to justify terrible treatments of women. It painted them as weak, broken, and full of evil. And because the alleged problem was invisible and internal, there was no way to prove or disprove it. Women were left suffering, not only from their original ailments but from the additional trauma of toad removal therapies. Modern medicine obviously finds this laughable now, but back then, this belief shaped how female health was understood. It also reveals a chilling aspect of medieval thought, that the female body was a mystery, and anything strange must be dangerous, magical, or monstrous. The toad in the stomach was more than just a creature. It was a symbol of how misunderstood and mistreated women were throughout history. 4. Bad smells can cure the plague. Just sniff some poop. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, killing tens of millions, panic spread even faster than the plague itself. Medical knowledge was primitive, and in the absence of science, people turned to superstition, desperation, and, yes, some really bad smells. At the core of this bizarre chapter in medieval medicine was a belief that the plague was caused by miasma, poisonous, corrupted air. And if bad air caused the sickness, then perhaps even worse smells could counteract it. Enter the horrifying logic of medieval doctors and citizens alike. If you wanted to fight the plague, you needed to overpower the bad air with something even more foul. That's right. They believed that deeply inhaling things like rotting garbage, sewage, or literal human feces might save your life. Some people carried small pouches filled with dung or decaying animals around their necks, hoping the stench would protect them from the invisible, plague-ridden air. One of the most popular tools of the era was the pomander, a ball filled with herbs, spices, and sometimes downright rancid ingredients like ambergris, a waxy substance found in whale intestines. But in lower-class communities, where perfumed oils were too expensive, people went for what was accessible: dead rats, moldy bread, even spoiled meat. It wasn't uncommon for desperate folks to smear themselves in waste or sit in latrines, believing they were building an odor shield strong enough to ward off death. Even physicians participated in this madness. Plague doctors wore the now iconic beaked masks not just to look terrifying, but to stuff the beaks with pungent herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges. They'd wander plague-ridden streets breathing through these makeshift filters, hoping it would protect them from the bad humors. In many cases, they were just as confused as their patients. Incredibly, this wasn't a fringe belief. Entire towns burned fragrant woods in massive pyres, hoping the smoke would cleanse the air. Church bells rang constantly, not only as a call to prayer but to disrupt the supposedly stagnant air with sound waves. Others burst into song, banged pots, or fired cannons into the sky, thinking loud noises could shake the disease loose. One of the most haunting examples comes from the city of Avignon, where plague victims were buried so quickly and in such large numbers that bodies were stacked in mass graves. The odor of death was inescapable, and yet, some believed this smell itself was keeping them alive. Looking back, this obsession with stench reveals how fear warps logic. In the absence of germ theory, people clung to whatever explanations gave them a sense of control, even if it meant rubbing yourself with human waste. And in a strange twist of fate, some of these methods may have incidentally helped. Those who stayed far from others to avoid smell might have also avoided infection. Still, there's no getting around it. In the face of one of history's deadliest diseases, many people genuinely thought that sniffing poop might be the cure. 5. Witch milking and magical imps. Medieval men thought witches had secret creatures that drank their blood. When it came to witches in the Middle Ages, people didn't just believe women flew on broomsticks or whispered curses under the moon. They believed witches had secret familiars, tiny demon-like creatures that drank from special parts of their bodies. These so-called witches' imps, or familiars, were believed to be small animals or spirit beings that served their witch masters, and they didn't survive on normal food. Nope. They fed on blood, and not from just anywhere. From specific, hidden, and deeply misunderstood spots on the witch's body. Welcome to the terrifyingly absurd world of witch milking. In dozens of trials across Europe, accusations claimed that witches had additional nipples. Yes, secret nipples that were used to nourish their demonic pets. These weren't located in the usual places. According to medieval inquisitors, these extra teats could be found under the armpit, on the thigh, behind the ear, or even between the toes. If a woman had any strange skin mark, like a mole, a birthmark, or even an ingrown hair, it could be declared a witch's teat. The presence of such a mark was enough evidence to condemn someone to death. The witch hunts were not just about burning people at the stake. They involved systematic and deeply humiliating examinations. Accused women, and sometimes men, were stripped naked and poked, prodded, and scratched by officials searching for these mystical feeding ports. If the mark didn't bleed when pricked, it was seen as confirmation of guilt. They truly believed demons drank from those spots. Testimonies from terrified villagers made it even weirder. Some claimed to have seen witches breastfeeding toads, cats, or even shadowy humanoid beings. They swore that these creatures could speak, vanish into thin air, or fly into people's homes to spread curses. In a world without science or skepticism, these stories spread like wildfire. And where did these ideas come from? A twisted blend of folklore, fear, and misogyny. The church and the state saw women's independence and knowledge, especially midwives and herbalists, as dangerous. By creating a mythos where women were physically bonded to evil through their bodies, they gave themselves justification to torture and execute them. In some parts of Europe, women even confessed to feeding their imps, though almost always under torture. The confessions were filled with contradictions, absurd imagery, and fantastical claims, but they were taken seriously by the courts. The idea of a woman secretly feeding a demon in the dark corners of her cottage was enough to send an entire village into chaos. What's most disturbing is how far this belief went. In Scotland, England, France, and Germany, entire manuals were written instructing inquisitors on how to find and confirm witches' teats. These were used in real court proceedings. Lives were ended based on whether someone had an oddly shaped mole. So the next time you look in the mirror and see a weird freckle or mark, be glad you're not living in the 1500s. Because to them, that was all the proof they needed, that you were milking demons in the dead of night. 6. The hairy surprise. People believed bears could father children. In a time before science offered explanations for genetics and reproduction, the medieval imagination was left to run completely wild. And wild it went. One of the most bizarre beliefs circulating in Europe was the idea that bears, not just animals of the forest, but actual bears, could impregnate women. Yes, this was not some fringe belief held by a handful of lunatics. This was widespread folklore that even found its way into legal texts, family stories, and regional legends. It all began with a misunderstanding of nature and biology. People noticed that some babies were born with an unusual amount of body hair, darker complexions, or certain animalistic features. Instead of chalking it up to genetics, poor nutrition, or random variation, the answer was clear to them: bestiality. Specifically, the mother must have had some illicit contact with a bear. The bear, in medieval imagination, wasn't just a beast. It was a powerful, sexual, and mysterious creature often associated with lust and danger. Some believed that bears were attracted to human women and that these encounters, though terrifying, could result in hybrid offspring. There were stories passed from town to town about women who gave birth to children with hairy backs or claw-like hands, and the whisper would start, "It must have been a bear." Even if the mother denied any such encounter, and of course she would, people would point to the child's physical traits as undeniable proof. This belief was especially popular in rural regions, where people lived closer to wildlife and where superstition often replaced science. But even in urban areas, tales of bear-born children circulated through songs, sermons, and folklore compilations. Some texts even tried to rationalize the mechanics, suggesting bears would disguise themselves or seduce women in dreams. This wasn't just an isolated myth. It played a role in shaping how people viewed deformities, appearance, and even morality. If a child looked different, it was treated not just as a medical mystery but a moral failing of the mother. She must have sinned. She must have done something unnatural. And the consequence? A cursed, animal-like child. There are even court records from certain regions that show children being abandoned or hidden away because they were believed to be part animal. In some cases, they were killed at birth. In others, they were raised but feared by their own communities. It's hard to know how many lives were destroyed because someone's baby was born with a full head of hair. Some of the legends even gave names to these hybrid children. In Slavic mythology, creatures like the Medvedev, which literally means of the bear, were believed to be human bear offspring, often associated with strength, rage, or dark powers. These myths sometimes turned the children into heroes, but more often, they were treated like monsters. It all points to a chilling truth about medieval thinking. Anything unexplained was terrifying. Any deviation from the norm was blamed on the supernatural or the sinful. Instead of compassion, there was suspicion. Instead of investigation, there was accusation. So the next time you see a kid with a unibrow or a little too much chest hair, just be glad you're not living in a century where that might get you accused of sleeping with a bear. 7. Cursed bread, the town that tripped on a mass hallucination. Imagine waking up one morning in a peaceful medieval village, only to find your neighbors screaming, flailing their arms, and running in circles, convinced they're on fire or being chased by invisible monsters. This wasn't a horror story or a local legend. It actually happened, and the explanation is as bizarre as the behavior. In 1518, in the small town of Strasbourg, now modern-day France, a strange and terrifying event took place. Dozens of people began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. This wasn't joyful dancing. It was frenzied, unstoppable, and sometimes fatal. People danced until their feet bled. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others reportedly died from strokes or heart attacks brought on by the madness. 4 days, the local authorities were baffled. Some thought it was a form of possession. Others blamed hot blood, demonic influence, or even divine punishment. But centuries later, modern historians began to suspect a different, even stranger cause: cursed bread. Specifically, bread made from rye contaminated with a fungus called ergot. Ergot is a hallucinogenic mold, chemically similar to LSD. When consumed, it can cause vivid hallucinations, muscle spasms, paranoia, and intense fear. If a batch of rye bread was infected and then distributed across an entire village, it could have caused a mass psychogenic event. Imagine an entire community unknowingly tripping together, without any concept of what was happening to them. And it wasn't just Strasbourg. Similar dancing plagues were recorded across Europe in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The symptoms were eerily alike. People claimed to see visions, feel pain under their skin, or hear voices commanding them to dance. In one report from the Netherlands, a group of affected villagers insisted that a saint told them to keep dancing or suffer divine wrath. Now here's the twist. Even when people were clearly suffering, the townsfolk and officials tried to treat the situation by making it worse. In Strasbourg, the local council literally hired musicians and built a stage, hoping the dancers would just get it out of their system. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. It only encouraged the delusion. More people joined in, and the hallucinations got more intense. But ergot isn't just about dancing. Other ergot poisoning outbreaks caused much darker symptoms. People believing bugs were crawling under their skin, hearing demonic voices, or feeling like their limbs were on fire. Some clawed at their own flesh. Others ran into rivers thinking they were full of flames. One documented case describes a man who cut off his own hand because he believed it had been possessed. Cursed bread became a fear in many rural communities. Bakers were sometimes accused of sorcery or of intentionally poisoning their neighbors. Markets began inspecting rye more closely. Herbalists recommended adding holy water or silver coins to dough, hoping to ward off evil spirits, or, more practically, spoilage. And of course, the church had its own explanation: sin. If a town was struck with the dancing curse, priests called for mass confessions, processions, and exorcisms. In some towns, massive wooden crosses were erected and people were forced to kneel for hours on end, begging for forgiveness, all while hallucinators flailed in the background. The legacy of this belief is still visible today. The term Vitus's dance was coined in reference to these episodes, linking the chaos to the patron saint of epileptics and dancers. It shows how deeply the medieval world merged physical illness with moral judgment and spiritual panic. So next time your bread looks a little moldy, just be thankful it won't have you sprinting into the town square, convinced your shadow is trying to eat you. In the Middle Ages, all it took was one sandwich, and your entire world could melt into madness. 8. Left-handed people are evil, obviously. In the grand tapestry of medieval nonsense, few beliefs were as stubborn, irrational, and oddly specific as the absolute terror of left-handed people. Yes, being left-handed in the Middle Ages wasn't just inconvenient, it was considered dangerous, sinful, and maybe even satanic. If you were born a lefty back then, congratulations. Society pretty much had a spiritual panic attack every time you picked up a spoon. The word sinister literally comes from the Latin word for left. That alone tells you how deep the fear ran. In medieval Christian Europe, anything associated with the left side, left hands, left feet, left turns, was seen as suspicious. The right hand symbolized righteousness, divinity, and order. The left hand, corruption, chaos, and the devil. This belief wasn't a minor superstition, it was baked into daily life. Children who naturally used their left hands were forced to switch. Teachers, priests, and even parents tied kids' left hands behind their backs to make them write, eat, or work with the holy right hand. If a child persisted in using their left hand, it was considered not just disobedience but a sign of spiritual defiance. Some even believed it was a mark of demonic influence. Think about what that means. Being born with a neurological preference that made you better at using one hand was interpreted as evil. Imagine a child reaching out to hold a cup with their left hand and hearing their teacher shout, "That's the devil's side." It happened, more often than you'd think. In courtrooms, witnesses who gestured with their left hand were often seen as untrustworthy. Artists who painted with their left were pressured to switch hands. Midwives were even taught to examine newborns for early signs of left-handedness, like hand dominance while breastfeeding, and warn parents to correct the child immediately. This fear had roots in the Bible, but also in older pagan symbolism. The right side of the body was often linked with masculinity, strength, and good luck. The left side represented femininity, weakness, and danger. Combine that with centuries of religious paranoia and you get a social system where a left-handed person could be viewed as inherently cursed. There are records of monks being denied advancement in their orders for being left-handed. Some were even accused of heresy because their handwriting leaned the wrong way. In a world where scriptoriums were sacred and writing was a holy act, the direction your ink flowed became a theological issue. Weapon design also reinforced the prejudice. Swords, shields, and armor were all made with right-handed fighters in mind. A left-handed knight was not only seen as suspicious but also as a liability on the battlefield. In tournaments, justs were standardized to favor right-handed combatants, and a left-handed challenger was often assumed to be cheating, using unorthodox and dishonest methods. Even in marriages, a left-handed bride or groom could be rejected based on that one trait alone. Rumors would spread. She's a witch. He's cursed. Their children will be twisted. Marriage contracts in some regions even included clauses about normal handedness as a qualification. And don't think you could just hide it. In public ceremonies, feasts, church rituals, legal proceedings, left-handed gestures were frowned upon. Taking communion with the left hand was seen as disrespectful to God. Swearing an oath with your left hand was invalid. You could be dismissed, punished, or laughed out of court. In art and literature, villains and traitors were often portrayed using their left hand, stealing, stabbing, or making deals with devils. Meanwhile, saints and holy figures were always painted using their right. The subconscious message was clear: goodness is right-handed. All of this fed a self-reinforcing loop. Because left-handed people were mistreated, they learned to hide it. Because they hid it, society assumed being left-handed was shameful. Because it was shameful, it became suspicious. And because it was suspicious, it must be evil. Welcome to medieval logic. But here's the thing, despite all this pressure, left-handed people didn't disappear. They adapted. They developed ambidextrous skills. They learned to write upside down or backwards. They became scribes, artists, musicians, and warriors anyway. Some even thrived in secret, passing on their skills in hidden ways. Today, being left-handed is just a quirky trait. But back then, it was practically a spiritual diagnosis. So if you're a lefty, wear it with pride. Because in the Middle Ages, you would have been feared, punished, and maybe even burned, just for holding your fork the wrong way. 9. Eating lettuce makes you infertile, but boiled bat wings? Totally fine. Let's talk about lettuce. Yes, that harmless, crunchy, watery vegetable you toss into your salad without a second thought. In the Middle Ages, it was more than just a side dish. It was a threat to your manhood, your fertility, and possibly your soul. According to medieval belief, eating lettuce could make you infertile, weak, or less masculine. And while they feared lettuce like it was a cursed vegetable, they were more than happy to recommend things like boiled bat wings and fried animal organs to boost your reproductive health. It's hard to overstate just how strange medical thinking was during this time. Rooted in ancient Greek philosophy and heavily influenced by Galen's theory of the four humors, the people of the Middle Ages believed the body was governed by balances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each food, activity, or emotion could tilt this balance, creating illness, mood changes, or, yes, infertility. Lettuce, according to physicians of the time, was considered cold and moist, terrible qualities for those seeking vitality and virility. Men were told that too much lettuce would cool their inner fire, lower their libido, and even damage their ability to have children. The more chilled your system, the less likely you were to be a proper man. Monks were even warned not to consume too much of it, lest their vows of celibacy become too easy to keep. One 13th century text warned that men who ate lettuce regularly would lose their seed, become slow in thought, and grow passive in temperament. In an age when masculinity was tied to aggression, strength, and dominance, these warnings were taken very seriously. You were what you ate, and if you ate a coward's vegetable, you'd become one. But let's contrast that with what they did recommend. To boost virility and fertility, medieval doctors proposed a wide array of recipes that read more like potion ingredients than dietary advice. Boiled bat wings were high on the list. Bats, being creatures of the night and fast in flight, were believed to possess strong life forces. Eating them was supposed to inject you with their energy and mystery. One common fertility recipe involved drying the wings, grinding them into powder, and mixing them with wine. Another popular preparation had them boiled with cloves, goat testicles, and mint, a romantic dinner for two if you're both cursed. This wasn't even the weirdest remedy. Some advised eating roasted hedgehog hearts, powdered wolf bones, or drinking wine infused with crushed beetles. Meanwhile, lettuce remained the villain. Pregnant women were warned to avoid it at all costs. Midwives wrote that lettuce could chill the womb, or even cause miscarriage. Even touching too much lettuce was seen as risky, especially during planting or harvest. The myth expanded beyond just eating to include proximity. Lettuce fields became suspect zones for anyone hoping to have children. It got weirder. In some regions, people believed that lettuce itself was born sterile. Unlike the symbolic power of pomegranates, fertility, or wheat, abundance, lettuce was limp, watery, and uninspired. Its very structure seemed to defy vitality. The thin leaves, pale color, and lack of aroma made it the anti-food for fertility. It was everything the medieval mindset feared: cool, neutral, soft, and passive. So, what was seen as fertility-enhancing? Alongside bat wings, men were encouraged to consume bull testicles, often raw. The logic: eat the organ you want to strengthen. This kind of magical thinking was everywhere. Want sharper eyesight? Eat an owl's eyes. Want to sing better? Swallow a nightingale's tongue. Want stronger sperm? Bathe in a mixture of goat milk and ground antlers. Compared to these, lettuce was downright villainous. And yes, there were attempts to redeem lettuce, but only with heavy cooking. If you boiled it with hot spices like pepper or ginger, It could supposedly balance its dangerous coldness. But who wanted to do that when bat soup was on the menu? There's an even more absurd layer. Some clergy and physicians claimed that lettuce could dampen the spirit, making it a secret tool of celibacy. In monasteries, rumors spread that feeding monks extra lettuce would help them avoid temptation. A lettuce-heavy diet was considered a kind of edible chastity belt. Meanwhile, peasants, those without access to exotic ingredients like bat wings or bear fat, often just avoided lettuce entirely during child-rearing years. Superstitions spread that even feeding lettuce to animals could make them barren. In some regions, farmers avoided planting it near cows or chickens, afraid it would affect the entire ecosystem's fertility. Of course, none of this was based on science. Lettuce is actually quite nutritious, especially for hydration and digestion. But in a world where fear often replaced fact, this harmless veggie became a scapegoat for everything from infertility to low libido to spiritual weakness. So the next time someone questions your salad choices, just be glad they're not accusing you of trying to kill your bloodline. In the Middle Ages, a plate of romaine was basically a fertility curse. But hey, at least you weren't sipping boiled bat wings. 10. The cure for baldness? Rub goose poop on your head. Ah, baldness. A timeless fear among men, even in the Middle Ages. But back then, Rogaine wasn't an option. Hair plugs didn't exist. So, what did people do when their hair started falling out? Simple. They grabbed a goose, waited for it to do its business, and smeared the droppings on their scalp like it was a miracle cream. Yes, seriously. Goose poop. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Actual avian excrement, rubbed, massaged, and applied like a spa treatment. And somehow, this was considered not only normal, but sophisticated medicine. Let's rewind to understand how this wild belief came to be. Medieval medicine revolved around the balance of humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each connected to different organs, personalities, and diseases. Hair loss? Obviously, an imbalance. And the solution, of course, required something that stimulated the body's natural heat and regeneration. Goose poop, for whatever reason, was believed to be packed with that kind of energy. The reasoning? Geese are warm, active creatures. Their droppings were hot and moist in Galenic terms. The idea was that this heat could wake up the lazy follicles on your scalp. The same logic was used to apply other animal products too: ferret kidneys, cow bile, and even pig's urine. But goose poop stood out, probably because it was easy to collect and abundant. Physicians didn't just throw it on there randomly. There were recipes. One version involved mixing fresh goose poop with crushed garlic and a bit of vinegar, letting it ferment for 3 days under sunlight, and then applying it to the scalp 3 times a week. If it started to burn, that meant it was working. If it attracted flies? Bonus. Flies love good medicine. Some accounts say men would shave their heads completely, then apply the mixture, and wrap their heads in warm cloth soaked in goat milk. The goal was to open the pores and let the goosey magic sink in. Of course, the smell was horrendous, but hey, beauty is pain. Monasteries, surprisingly, were big on goose poop treatments. Baldness among monks was common, partly by design with the tonsure haircut, but there was a fine line between fashionable religious baldness and looking like you were wasting away. So monks experimented with every folk remedy available, goose dung being one of the top contenders. Goose droppings also had a reputation beyond hair. Some believed it could cure rashes, treat gout, and even reduce the appearance of boils. It was a medieval multitasker. One record from a 14th century apothecary lists goose poop as an ingredient in no less than 17 different ointments. That's right, 17. From head to toe, they were rubbing this stuff everywhere. And let's talk about the class divide here. Wealthy noblemen? They had deluxe versions of this treatment. They'd add rosewater, saffron, or cinnamon oil to the mix, not for effectiveness, but to mask the smell. Even royalty wasn't immune to baldness fears. King Charles VI of France reportedly had an ointment regimen that included goose feces and crushed pearls. Because nothing says opulence like bird poop and gemstones. Of course, not everyone was on board. there were critics, early skeptics who thought this was nonsense. Some university-trained physicians dismissed it as rural superstition and called for more refined cures like mercury vapor or ox blood. Yes, you read that right. The more scientific option at the time was inhaling toxic metal fumes or bathing in animal blood. Pick your poison. Even so, the goose poop method persisted for centuries. Word-of-mouth testimonials kept it alive. My cousin tried it and his hair grew back like a boar's. One folk healer reportedly had a waiting list for her goose dung paste. She even sold it in little clay pots labeled with religious symbols, just in case divine intervention helped the formula work better. Modern historians now look back and shake their heads, but there's something strangely endearing about it all. The desperation to hold on to hair, to feel youthful, to avoid the visible signs of aging, it's universal. Whether you're in the 1300s or the 2020s, losing your hair still stings. And maybe, just maybe, we're not so different after all. Only now, we've swapped the goose poop for expensive shampoos and laser treatments. In the end, no clinical trials confirmed goose dung worked. No records show a bald man emerging with luscious locks. But it didn't matter. For people in the Middle Ages, the hope was real. And sometimes, hope is stronger than evidence, especially when you're rubbing bird droppings on your head under a full moon, praying to Saint Baldric, and waiting for the magic to kick in. 11. If your child is ugly, it might be a changeling. Let's dive into one of the darkest and most heartbreaking beliefs of the Middle Ages. The idea that if your child looked a little strange, acted oddly, or simply cried too much, they might not be your child at all. No, some people believed the real baby had been stolen, and what you were raising was a changeling. A creature left behind by fairies or demons, meant to deceive and torment you. In a time before modern medicine, mental health awareness, or developmental science, people desperately searched for explanations. And when a baby was born with deformities, or when a healthy child suddenly changed, stopped smiling, wouldn't speak, cried endlessly, the explanation wasn't genetics, illness, or autism. It was something much more supernatural, a fairy switch. The changeling myth was common all across Europe. In Ireland, Scandinavia, Germany, and France, tales spread of hidden forest dwellers, fairies, trolls, goblins, or devils, who would steal away healthy human babies and leave behind one of their own. These imposters, or changelings, looked mostly like the child they replaced, but something was always off. Maybe their eyes were too big, their heads too small, their behavior too strange, their laughter too hollow, their cries too long. And if a child didn't thrive, mothers often blamed fairies. Villagers would whisper behind their backs, "That boy isn't right. She must have left the cradle open. The fairies took him." These weren't just stories. They were real beliefs, leading to very real, and often cruel, actions. So how did people test whether a child was a changeling? Here's where it gets disturbing. Some believed that putting a changeling near fire would make it leap up and flee, revealing its true nature. Others said to place the child on a hot shovel or dangle them over flames, thinking the discomfort would make the fairy panic and bring the real baby back. Yes, you read that right. Babies were tortured in the name of superstition. Another test involved boiling eggshells. According to some folktales, a changeling would be so puzzled by this strange act that it would speak up in an old, raspy voice, revealing it wasn't a child at all. One legend tells of a mother boiling eggshells when the infant in the crib suddenly said, "Well, I've seen an oak grow from an acorn, but never have I seen eggshells boiled." That was the proof she needed. And yet, some changelings weren't treated violently. Some were simply rejected, neglected, abandoned. Parents would stop feeding them, stop bathing them, stop speaking to them, hoping the fairies would grow bored and return their true child. In harsher cases, changelings were taken into the woods and left there. This wasn't considered murder. It was considered justice. It's important to understand the historical context. The Middle Ages were brutal, uncertain, and filled with suffering. Infant mortality was high. Disease ran rampant. Disabilities were poorly understood. And when you combine grief, fear, and ignorance with folklore, you get tragedy. The changeling myth gave people someone to blame. It gave them a false sense of control. But it also gave them permission to abandon the most vulnerable. Some scholars now believe that changeling stories were often about children with what we'd now recognize as genetic disorders, autism spectrum conditions, or physical disabilities. Things like cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, or microcephaly were interpreted not as medical conditions, but as evidence of inhumanity. Church leaders didn't help. While some priests denounced the abuse of children, others reinforced the belief that malformed or strange children were punishments from God, or tricks of the devil. In rural areas, people turned more to folk healers than clergy anyway, and these healers often used ancient rituals and herbs meant to draw out the changeling or appease the fairies. In Irish lore, there were even changeling midwives, women believed to have the power to identify or recover a stolen child. Some were revered, others were feared. Some claimed to retrieve a baby by beating the changeling with a broom made of thorn branches, shouting prayers, and demanding the fairies return what they'd taken. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, tales were even more elaborate. Some said you could trap a fairy with a mirror. Others said a child born under a full moon was more likely to be stolen. Doors had to be shut, keyholes sealed, iron left in cradles. Iron was thought to repel magical beings. Rings of salt were sometimes drawn around beds to protect infants. Every step was soaked in fear. Not all changeling beliefs were dark. In some stories, the changeling wasn't cruel or evil, just different. Some tales even showed them growing up to become wise, magical, or special in their own right. But those were rare. More often, the changeling was blamed for bad harvests, family misfortunes, or the unraveling of a mother's sanity. And in the end, the most tragic part is this. So many innocent children suffered, not because they were monsters, but because they were misunderstood. Their cries, their silence, their bodies, were all seen as threats. Their humanity was stripped away by myth. They weren't loved. They weren't held. They weren't named. They were just other. It's easy to scoff now, to say, how could anyone believe such things? But remember, these stories came from real fears, real pain, real helplessness. In a world without answers, people clung to whatever explanation gave them comfort, even if it came at a devastating cost. Today, we know better. We understand disabilities, mental health, neurodiversity. We fight for inclusion. But the changeling stories remain, dark reflections of a time when the unknown was not met with curiosity, but cruelty. They remind us how far we've come, and how easy it is to fall into fear when faced with what we don't understand. 12. Mice are born from hay, not mating, spontaneous generation. In the strange world of medieval beliefs, one of the most bizarre ideas was spontaneous generation, the notion that life could emerge from non-living matter. And not just in a general sense. People genuinely believed that mice could be born directly out of hay, old rags, or even piles of grain. All you had to do was leave the right materials in the right spot, and poof, tiny squeaking mice would just appear, like magic. This idea wasn't fringe. It wasn't limited to some superstitious villagers tucked away in a dark forest. No, some of the greatest thinkers of the era believed this wholeheartedly. Greek philosopher Aristotle, who was the gold standard of science for over 1,000 years, wrote extensively about spontaneous generation. He believed it was the natural way for lower life forms to emerge. To him, frogs came from mud, flies from rotting meat, and mice from damp hay. He even specified the conditions under which they'd appear. The belief held strong through centuries. Medieval scholars, monks, and early naturalists echoed these views without question. In the 13th century, the famous Franciscan friar Roger Bacon referenced spontaneous generation in his writings. So did Albertus Magnus. They weren't being metaphorical, they thought it was science. And here's where it gets even stranger. People actually designed recipes to produce animals. One so-called scientific method instructed you to put a piece of soiled cloth in a dark corner with wheat or barley and wait 21 days. After that time, mice were supposed to appear, fully formed, ready to scurry away. Some even said the mice would be born directly from the cloth and grains, fermenting essence. But it didn't stop with mice. This belief stretched to insects, frogs, snakes, and even eels. Rotting meat. A perfect place for maggots. Wet leaves. Salamander eggs. Obviously, there was an underlying belief that nature was so fertile, so mysterious, that life just happened. People saw cause and effect without understanding the mechanisms in between. Why was this idea so appealing? It provided an easy answer. You didn't have to understand reproduction. You didn't need to observe animal behavior. You didn't even need to ask hard questions. If creatures popped up in a pile of hay, well, then hay must be the mother. The church didn't argue with it. In fact, many clerics embraced spontaneous generation as evidence of divine mystery. It showed that God could create life from dust at any moment. It confirmed the Bible's creation stories in a literal way. If God made Adam from dirt, then surely a few mice from straw wasn't a stretch. But this belief had consequences. It affected hygiene, city planning, agriculture, and medicine. People didn't think to block access points for pests. They assumed the rats were born inside the food. Diseases were blamed on the bad air or humors, not on the breeding of fleas or poor waste control. The belief also led to bizarre experiments. In the 17th century, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, a Flemish chemist and physician, claimed he had successfully created mice. His formula: take a dirty shirt, stuff it with wheat, and leave it in a box for 21 days. He swore the mice had emerged on schedule. His notes were detailed, and many accepted his findings without question. Van Helmont was a respected figure, not some random crank. And because the idea fit with centuries of accepted wisdom, no one thought to doubt him. This led to further acceptance across Europe. Farmers believed grain spoilage wasn't caused by mice. They believed the spoilage created the mice. They burned piles of hay thinking it would stop infestations. They blamed witches for infestations if the spontaneous generation failed to stop. Some even thought different kinds of grain would produce different colored mice. The turning point didn't come until the late 1600s. An Italian physician named Francesco Redi began questioning the old beliefs. He performed an experiment where he covered meat with cloth, proving that maggots didn't just appear, they came from flies. His work was a revolution, but many still clung to the old beliefs for decades after. Eventually, with the rise of microscopes and germ theory, spontaneous generation was debunked. But it took over 1800 years from Aristotle's time for science to finally bury the idea. And even then, echoes of it persisted in folktales and rural beliefs well into the 19th century. Looking back, it's wild to think that people believed hay could give birth to mice. But in a world without proper scientific methods, without tools for close observation, and with a deep desire to explain the unexplained, spontaneous generation filled the gap. It gave them something to believe in, even if it was hilariously wrong. It's a reminder of how easily misinformation can take root when people don't have the tools, or the will, to question what they're told. And honestly, it's also kind of charming. The idea that the world is so alive that life could just pop out of your old laundry. It's dumb. It's medieval. And it's absolutely fascinating. 13. Lunar eclipses are caused by giant sky wolves. Long before telescopes and space probes revealed the mysteries of the cosmos, people looked to the skies with awe, fear, and endless speculation. In medieval Europe, the appearance of a lunar eclipse wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a terrifying omen, one often explained with teeth, claws, and supernatural fury. According to Norse and Germanic folklore, a great wolf named Hati chased the moon through the night sky. When he caught up, he would sink his monstrous jaws into the glowing orb, plunging the world into darkness. That, people believed, was what caused a lunar eclipse. But Hati wasn't alone. His brother, Skoll, chased the sun. And in the terrifying Norse vision of Ragnarok, the end of the world, these wolves would finally succeed. Skoll would devour the sun, Hati the moon, and the heavens would go dark forever. This myth didn't just live in the margins of Viking sagas. It echoed through medieval consciousness, especially in the darker corners of Europe where pagan traditions clung on for generations. So when a lunar eclipse painted the moon in blood-red shadow, entire villages would erupt in panic. It wasn't just sky stuff, it was a wolf, a demon, a sign that divine punishment or apocalyptic change was near. Church bells rang out to scare off the beast. People shouted prayers into the night, lit fires, and even fired arrows at the sky in an attempt to drive away the invisible predator. Christian interpretations didn't offer much comfort. Many saw lunar eclipses as divine messages, warnings of plague, famine, war, or the devil's influence creeping into the earthly realm. Some monks recorded eclipses alongside famines and earthquakes, convinced that they were connected. They weren't wrong to be scared. Many eclipses coincided with actual disasters. But that was coincidence, not cause. Still, it made the superstition stronger. In some regions, it was believed that pregnant women should never look at a lunar eclipse. Doing so might cause deformities in their unborn children. Some thought their babies would be born marked by the wolf, with strange birthmarks or behavioral disorders. Midwives would cover windows with cloth, turn mothers' beds away from moonlight, and pray throughout the night. Other cultures had their own sky creatures. In Central Asia, it was a dragon. In India, Rahu, a decapitated demon, was blamed for swallowing the moon. But in Europe, wolves ruled the myth. And the image of a great beast devouring the heavens wasn't just metaphor, it was belief, absolute and unquestioned. Many medieval scholars tried to explain eclipses, drawing from ancient Greek astronomy, but these explanations were limited to monasteries and elite academics. The average person didn't read Latin. They didn't understand planetary motion. What they did understand was fear. And nothing said, "Be afraid," like a glowing moon vanishing behind a shadowy curtain. The anxiety was contagious. When one village heard that another had seen the wolf in the sky, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the wolf only attacked sinful regions. Others claimed it was targeting the church itself. This fear was weaponized. Some priests used eclipses to reinforce their authority. "Repent," they'd say, "or the next time the wolf won't let go." Even kings paid attention. Chronicles from the 11th and 12th centuries show that lunar eclipses were recorded in royal annals. Decisions were postponed. Battles delayed. Treaties rushed or cancelled. Because if a sky wolf was out for blood, who knew what else might follow? Of course, these beliefs weren't entirely isolated to Europe. But what made the medieval version so vivid was how real it felt to those living through it. The sky was alive. The stars told stories. And the moon wasn't just a rock, it was prey. Over time, the myths evolved. By the Renaissance, more people began to accept astronomical models. The invention of the telescope helped. But even then, old ideas died slowly. Some rural folk still banged pots and pans to scare away the wolf well into the 1700s. It's easy to laugh now, but try to imagine it. You're a farmer in 1350. You've lost half your village to plague. You don't know why. Your priest says it's sin. The moon starts to bleed, and the only explanation you've ever heard is that a monstrous wolf is attacking the sky. What else would you believe? So you light a candle. You gather your family. You pray. And when the moon returns, you thank God, or the village archer, for saving the world. In truth, the tale of the sky wolf is one of survival. A myth built not just on ignorance, but on the desperate human need to make sense of chaos. To assign shape to the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, to feel a little less alone under a vast and terrifying sky. Next time you see a lunar eclipse, take a moment. Look up. And remember, once upon a time, people thought it meant the end of everything. 14. The church tried to put rats on trial, and sometimes won. In the strange world of medieval Europe, the line between reality and absurdity was often hard to spot. One of the most bizarre practices to emerge during this era was the legal prosecution of animals. Yes, actual courtroom trials where animals were summoned, judged, and even sentenced. And among the most infamous of these cases were trials involving rats. Picture this, a town plagued by vermin, its grain stores pillaged, its fields infested, its people furious. Rather than simply lay traps or set out poison, some communities turned to the highest authority they knew, the church. The rats were charged with theft, destruction of property, and defying the will of God. These weren't metaphorical accusations. In formal legal proceedings, sometimes lasting weeks, actual lawyers were assigned to defend these rodents. Judges, witnesses, clerics, all involved in trying to bring justice to rats. One of the most famous cases comes from 15th century Autun, France. The town had been suffering from a severe rat infestation, and so, in the year 1510, the local authorities did what any God-fearing people of the time might do. They issued a summons for the rats to appear in court. A man named Bartholomew Chassenny, a brilliant young lawyer, was appointed to defend them. Yes, this is a real historical figure. Chassenny would later become one of the most respected legal minds in France, but his first major case involved representing an entire population of rats. Now, here's where it gets even more absurd. When the rats failed to show up for their court date, imagine that, Chassenny argued that the summons was invalid. Why? Because the rats lived in multiple districts, and each rat would need time to travel safely through those districts. They were afraid of being attacked by cats and other predators along the way, he explained, and so could not reasonably be expected to attend. The judge accepted the argument and postponed the trial. That wasn't the end of it. The townspeople insisted the trial continue, frustrated that the vermin were still wreaking havoc. Chassenny returned with another argument. The church had failed to provide the rats with safe passage. If the court wanted a fair trial, it had to ensure the accused could travel without risk. Essentially, he told the church to build a rat-safe corridor. At every turn, Chassenny used logic, technicalities, and procedural law to stall the trial and protect the rats. The church eventually gave up. The rats were never convicted, and Chassenny became a legend. But why did these trials happen at all? Why would educated people waste time, resources, and energy trying animals in court? The answer lies in the worldview of the Middle Ages. People genuinely believed that animals could sin, that they had moral agency. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't just a matter of public safety, it was a theological offense. The animal had broken divine law, and divine law demanded justice. Church doctrine at the time held that animals were part of God's creation, and therefore subject to his laws. Just as humans could be punished for crimes, so too could beasts. If an animal committed a serious offense, murder, theft, heresy, it had to answer for it. And these weren't quick or symbolic gestures. Trials could last for weeks. Legal representation was common. Judges deliberated. Sentences were handed down. In some cases, animals were hanged, burned, or excommunicated. That's right, the church literally excommunicated pigs, goats, and insects. There are records of excommunications against locusts and weevils that had ravaged crops. Entire flocks of birds were cursed by bishops. Sometimes, these trials took a more symbolic or supernatural tone. The legal system wasn't just trying to punish animals, it was trying to reassert divine order in a chaotic world. Plagues, famines, and infestations were often interpreted as signs of God's anger. By prosecuting the guilty, the church and state were seen as restoring moral balance. There were even differences between how domesticated animals and wild animals were treated. Domesticated animals, like pigs, cows, or dogs, were tried in secular courts because they lived among humans and were seen as part of the community. Wild animals or insects, on the other hand, were usually cursed or excommunicated in ecclesiastical courts, since they couldn't be caught or punished in the usual way. The absurdity of these trials was not lost on everyone. Even during the time, some scholars and clerics criticized the practice. But the fear of divine retribution, combined with a deeply embedded belief in legal and spiritual order, kept these trials going for centuries. Interestingly, the practice wasn't confined to Catholic Europe. Similar animal trials were held in other regions and faith traditions. Islamic courts occasionally ruled on animal-related grievances. In India, ancient Hindu law included penalties for animals that damaged crops. But the medieval European obsession with legal procedure and theological symbolism made their trials uniquely elaborate and uniquely strange. Chassigny's defense of the rats became so famous that it was included in legal textbooks centuries later. He went on to write about legal procedures and served as a judge in multiple high courts. But nothing he did ever matched the sheer spectacle of standing in a courtroom and arguing that his clients, millions of tiny rodents, were innocent until proven guilty. To modern eyes, it seems laughable. But to the people of the Middle Ages, this was serious business. Law, faith, fear, and frustration came together in a strange dance of justice. In a world where lightning struck without warning, crops failed overnight, and plague crept in through unseen cracks, people craved order, even if that meant putting rats on trial. So next time you see a rat scurry across a city street, imagine it walking into a courtroom in a tiny robe, facing a judge, with a lawyer pleading its case. It happened. And for the people of the Middle Ages, it wasn't weird. It was justice. 15. Sex during a full moon will spawn monsters. For centuries, the full moon has sparked superstition, awe, and a fair bit of paranoia. But during the Middle Ages, that glowing orb in the sky came with warnings that could make anyone blush. Among the strangest beliefs of the time was the idea that engaging in sexual activity during a full moon could result in the birth of monsters. Yes, actual monsters. These weren't metaphorical, problem children. People genuinely feared that lunar-lit lovemaking would create offspring with grotesque deformities, animal features, or even demonic traits. And while modern minds may scoff, back then this belief shaped real behavior, laws, and social expectations. It all ties back to how medieval people viewed the moon, not just as a celestial body, but as a living influence that governed human emotions, fertility, and even morality. The moon was thought to control tides, madness, menstrual cycles, and of course, conception. In this worldview, timing intimacy with the full moon was like inviting chaos into the womb. Medical experts at the time, heavily influenced by Galenic traditions and Aristotelian philosophy, believed that the moon's pull was strongest during its fullest phase. They thought its light could overheat bodily humors, distort seed, or corrupt the soul of a child before it was even born. Monstrous births were often used as proof. When a child was born with a cleft palate, missing limbs, or conjoined features, whispers followed, "Was there a full moon that night?" These deformities weren't seen as random genetic mutations. They were divine punishment or supernatural corruption. Some clergy taught that God allowed the moon's power to serve as a test of virtue. Others blamed witches, seduction, or lunar spirits who snuck into bedrooms unnoticed. A woman who gave birth to a child with a tail or extra fingers might be accused of having laid with the moon. Church doctrine only made things worse. In an effort to control sin and sexuality, priests often linked lunar cycles to carnal urges. The full moon was associated with heightened temptation, an easy scapegoat for impure thoughts. Couples were warned in confessional to abstain during certain lunar phases. The idea that sex could be evil wasn't new, but the notion that it could create literal monsters gave new fuel to shame and fear. It turned marital intimacy into a spiritual minefield. Of course, midwives got caught in the crossfire. When babies were born under bad signs, midwives were accused of performing rituals or assisting in demonic births. Some were imprisoned, or worse, burned at the stake. The belief in lunar monster births wasn't just a quirky superstition. It destroyed lives. One of the most infamous cases comes from 13th century France, where a noblewoman gave birth to a child with unusual growths. Rather than treat it medically, her husband claimed it was the result of full moon intercourse and locked her in a convent. The child was hidden away. No autopsy, no science, just shame and exile. Rumors spread that the child had hooves. As printing expanded, so did the spread of lunar sex warnings. Pamphlets featured woodcuts of monstrous children, mothers weeping, and terrified villagers pointing to the sky. The message was clear: control your desires, or nature will shame you. These stories were often used in moral sermons, reinforcing the power of fear over reason. Even into the Renaissance, echoes of this myth persisted. Philosophers like Paracelsus and Agrippa debated the moon's effect on conception. Some thought certain planetary alignments during sex could produce genius or disaster. It wasn't until the scientific revolution and advancements in anatomy that such beliefs were fully challenged. Still, traces linger today. Modern folklore retains the full moon's association with madness and transformation. Think werewolves. And while we now know babies don't grow fangs from moonlight, the fear of sex, shame, and superstition continues to shape cultural taboos. So, next time you see a full moon, just be glad you weren't born in the Middle Ages, when the wrong timing in the bedroom could get you accused of birthing a monster. Because in that world, even the most intimate moments weren't safe from the cosmos. 16. Mermaids, dog-headed men, and elephant horses exist. In the shadowy maps of the medieval world, beyond the edges of known territories, there be monsters. Not merely metaphors, actual, horrifying, awe-inspiring creatures that filled the minds of peasants and kings alike with fear and wonder. While modern science scoffs, the people of the Middle Ages genuinely believed in a gallery of fantastical beasts. And not just in legends, they thought these beings were real, populating uncharted lands and occasionally even washing ashore. Let's begin with the mermaids. Today, they evoke images of singing Disney heroines or enchanting sirens from maritime lore. But to a medieval cartographer or sailor, mermaids were dangerous omens. Chronicled in manuscripts, stained glass, and even stone carvings in cathedrals, these creatures were believed to lure sailors to their doom. Their half-fish, half-human form symbolized temptation, and their appearance on maps wasn't just decorative. It was a warning. Sail further, and you may not return. Monks and scholars took these creatures seriously. The 13th century Icelandic manuscript, Konungsskuggsja, describes mermaids in unsettling detail, noting their human-like faces, long hair, and the sound of their screams as shipwrecks occurred nearby. Some believed these fishwomen could control storms, guiding ships into jagged rocks. Others thought they were fallen angels or demons sent to test the faith of men. And then there were the cynocephali, the infamous dog-headed men. One of the most repeated myths of the Middle Ages, the cynocephaly appeared in countless accounts from as early as ancient Greece but gained particular traction in medieval Europe. These were humanoid beings with canine heads, said to dwell in faraway lands such as India, Ethiopia, or the mysterious East. No less than St. Augustine himself referenced them, musing on whether the cynocephaly had souls and could be considered descendants of Adam. In other tales, they were fierce warriors, barking instead of speaking, who lived in tribes and wore armor. The legend of Saint Christopher, yes, the patron saint of travelers, at one point depicted him as a cynocephaly. Some versions describe him converting to Christianity despite his beastly head, which only made him more revered. Illustrations of these dog-headed men show them hunting, carrying swords, and riding horses. Some were said to be gentle and less provoked. Others, monstrous. To medieval Europeans, these creatures represented the blurred line between man and beast, especially when describing distant, unknown peoples in lands they feared but hadn't seen. Now, brace yourself for the piece de resistance of medieval absurdity: elephant horses. These weren't majestic centaurs or noble steeds. They were grotesque combinations of elephants' trunks with horses' bodies, occasionally drawn with tusks, wings, or even armored shells. What were they? No one knew exactly. These chimeric beings showed up in bestiaries, encyclopedias of animals that mixed fact with fantasy. Monks believed they lived in deserts, hunted lions, or battled dragons. Some thought they were the result of cursed unions between animals. Others placed them on the fringes of the known world, symbols of God's mysterious creations. So where did these creatures come from? A mixture of poor translation, wild imagination, and isolation from actual zoological knowledge. When explorers or merchants returned from the East with exaggerated stories or exotic hides, artists and scribes filled in the blanks. Literally, a rhinoceros might be drawn with armor plating and wings. A baboon, described with fangs and a tail, became a demon. Anything unfamiliar was mythologized. This wasn't harmless fantasy either. These beliefs shaped policy. When European monarchs planned crusades or trade missions, they accounted for the possibility of encountering monsters. Travelers carried relics and charms to ward off sea creatures. Religious leaders used tales of beasts to keep peasants in line. Stray too far, they warned, and you'll face the edge of the world and the monsters that await. Even the maps, the Mappa Mundi, reflected this. Massive circular world maps hung in cathedrals featured Jerusalem at the center, with fantastical beasts sketched along the periphery. Dragons, manticores, men with faces on their chests, and of course, mermaids and dog-headed tribes. In a world where information spread slowly and printing was non-existent, these myths weren't just believed, they were facts. Passed down in sermons, schoolrooms, and market gossip, they defined how Europeans saw the unknown. Today, we laugh at them. But imagine living in a world where the line between man and monster was always in question. Where explorers feared not just getting lost, but being devoured. That was the reality of the Middle Ages, a world filled with wonder, terror, and an unrelenting belief in the unbelievable. 17. Wearing gemstones prevents sin, and possibly taxes. In the tapestry of medieval superstition, one of the most bedazzling beliefs involved the mystical power of gemstones. Picture a world where people wore sapphires not for style, but because they genuinely believed the stone could stop them from sinning. Yes, the same gemstone your aunt wears to weddings was once thought to have divine control over your behavior. Sapphires, in particular, were linked with purity and chastity. Clergy, nobles, and even royalty would carry them as a kind of moral shield. To sin while wearing a sapphire? That was like breaking into a church while wearing a crucifix. Rubies were another crowd favorite. Associated with courage and love, people thought they could enhance one's vitality and protect against plague. A knight might wear a ruby into battle, not just because it looked impressive, but because he thought it could literally absorb danger. In some tales, if your ruby darkened, it meant evil was near, or worse, you were about to get sick. This was the Middle Ages version of a medieval mood ring, only with far higher stakes. Emeralds. They were believed to prevent possession and lust. Pearls were worn by the virtuous to promote modesty. Amethysts were believed to guard against drunkenness, leading many to embed them in goblets, because drinking wine from a gemmed cup was clearly going to stop you from getting sloshed. The logic was medieval. The belief extended beyond personal virtue. Gemstones were tied to wealth, divine favor, and even legal exemptions. Some tax collectors and church officials believed that those who wore certain gems had favor with God, and thus were more morally upright. Rumors circulated that people who wore specific combinations of stones could avoid tithes, trials, or judgment. In other words, wearing the right necklace could be your get-out-of-jail-free card. Astrology also played a role. Each gemstone was associated with a planet, and thus, a particular temperament or moral guidance. For example, topaz was linked to the sun and believed to illuminate the mind, encouraging wisdom. Saturn was associated with onyx and was thought to cool tempers and reduce lustful urges. People arranged their jewelry not just for appearance, but to balance their spiritual weaknesses. These beliefs weren't fringe, they were mainstream. Monks wrote treatises about the moral power of stones. Apothecaries recommended crushed gems in medicine. Kings funded expeditions to acquire rare stones not for riches, but for righteousness. Some even built chapels with gemstone-inlaid altars, hoping the divine energy would sanctify their prayers. The social status of gemstone wearers also influenced how they were judged. If you wore gems, it signaled piety, wisdom, and power. To criticize a gemstone wearer was to question divine judgment. So if someone sinned while wearing a sapphire or ruby, some believed the fault lay not with the person, but with the stone. Maybe it was fake. Maybe the energy had been corrupted. Maybe someone had cursed it. The blame game shifted to the gem, not the sinner. Some courts even allowed testimony about gemstones in legal defenses. If someone was accused of a moral crime but wore a reputed gemstone, they might argue their character was protected by divine influence. Imagine saying, "I couldn't have committed adultery, Your Honor. I had my amethyst pendant on." Of course, not everyone bought into this. Some clergy pushed back, warning that putting faith in rocks bordered on idolatry. But the belief held on for centuries, shaping jewelry markets, religious rituals, and legal assumptions. In a time when sin and salvation weren't just personal matters, but social currency, gemstones became a spiritual life hack. Whether it truly worked or not didn't matter. If others believed your emerald made you honest, that belief alone could open doors. Or close prison cells. So the next time you see someone flaunting their crystals or birthstones, just remember, at least they're not trying to avoid paying taxes with it. Probably. 18. Bathing is dangerous. Stay dirty to stay alive. In the medieval imagination, water was less a source of cleanliness and more a delivery system for death. Yes, somehow, somewhere along the twisted line of ancient reasoning, people decided that taking a bath could kill you. And so, for centuries, folks proudly marched around filthy, layered in sweat, grime, and the pungent musk of old cabbage stew. Let's rewind a bit. In ancient Rome, bathing was practically a sport. Public baths were social hubs. People bathed together, discussed politics, made business deals, and got squeaky clean. But after the fall of Rome, the infrastructure collapsed, and with it, much of the bathing culture disappeared. The church played no small role in what happened next. As Christianity spread through Europe, a new philosophy took root. Cleanliness of the body was considered a vanity, an indulgence of the flesh. Dirt, they said, was godly. Suffering through filth was a path to righteousness. Saints were celebrated for how long they went without washing. Saint Agnes, for example, supposedly never once looked at herself in a mirror. Saint Thomas Becket? They buried him in his rotting clothes. Medieval holiness, apparently, smelled like old onions. And then came the plagues. The Black Death devastated Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. People were terrified and desperate to understand how disease spread. Germ theory was still centuries away, so the leading theory of the time blamed miasmas, foul, poisonous airs that supposedly seeped into your pores and corrupted your humors. And how did they think the miasmas got in? Through open skin. See, when you bathe, your skin softens, pores open up, and, according to medieval logic, that's like leaving the front door wide open during a home invasion. So they reasoned, if you want to stay safe, seal yourself shut. Stay dirty. Let the filth build a protective crust. Royalty embraced this logic with gusto. Queen Elizabeth I was famously said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not. King Louis XIV. He reportedly only bathed twice in his life. People would go decades without a proper wash. Instead, they would layer perfumes and scented powders on their bodies like frosting on a very questionable cake. But even that had its limits. In places like 16th century Paris, you could literally smell a nobleman before you saw him. Wigs soaked in animal fat, clothes never washed, and breath reeking of tooth rot, it was a sensory apocalypse. And public bathhouses, which could have been a saving grace, were often seen as dens of sin. They were associated with prostitution, nudity, and moral decay. The church cracked down hard. Many bathhouses were shut down, and the idea of communal bathing faded into history. Yet ironically, doctors still recommended dry cleaning the body with linen cloths. They would advise gently rubbing the skin to remove top layers of filth, but without involving any water. Moisture invites death, one physician wrote in 1464. Let not thy body become the sponge through which evil passes. Of course, peasants didn't always have the luxury of avoiding water. They worked in rivers, dug ditches, and got rained on, but they weren't bathing by noble standards. They were just surviving. Eventually, by the 18th century, the tides, pun intended, began to turn. Medical science advanced. Soap improved. Cities developed plumbing. And the Enlightenment brought back the radical idea that maybe washing isn't evil? But for nearly 1,000 years, an entire continent chose to stink in the name of virtue. So the next time someone complains about your gym bag, remind them, you smell better than a king. 19. The devil can enter through your butthole, so cover it. Yes, you read that correctly. In the wild world of medieval beliefs, there was a deeply unsettling idea that evil, yes, literal evil, could crawl into your body through your backside. Forget haunted houses or cursed relics. In the superstitious mind of the Middle Ages, your own rear end was a portal for Satan himself. This strange belief wasn't just some fringe idea. It had roots in religious doctrine, societal fears, and a whole lot of bodily shame. First, let's explore where this bizarre notion may have originated. The medieval church, always eager to emphasize sin, purity, and the dangers of the flesh, often tied bodily functions to spiritual vulnerability. Flatulence wasn't just embarrassing, it was morally suspicious. Monks wrote about it. Priests warned about it. And somewhere along the line, the idea emerged that if something impure could come out of that place, then something unholy could go in. Enter Satan. People in the Middle Ages believed the devil was a shapeshifter. He could slither, slip, or fly into your life undetected. And in some writings, demons were described as seeking out the most unprotected or shameful parts of a person's body to invade. This led to some truly absurd rituals meant to protect the behind, such as sleeping face down, using special holy charms, or even clenching tightly during prayer. One particularly famous medieval legend tells of a monk who broke wind during a moment of deep meditation. According to the story, he immediately felt a dark presence enter the room. Later that night, he reportedly became possessed, screaming in Latin and levitating off the ground. Church authorities later declared that his unguarded act had opened the gates for infernal entry. The solution: greater discipline of the body. And yes, that included the rear. Medieval artwork occasionally hints at this paranoia. Marginalia in illuminated manuscripts often featured grotesque creatures crawling in and out of people's backsides. These weren't just jokes. They reflected genuine fears that evil lurked around every orifice. Clothing, too, was affected. Many garments in the Middle Ages were designed with layers and belts, not just for warmth or modesty, but also, according to some, as a barrier against demonic intrusion. A tight belt around the waist? That was like locking the spiritual back door. And let's not forget the role of fasting and purging. Monks and nuns engaged in extreme bodily control as a way to stay pure. They believed that cleansing the body helped protect it from spiritual corruption. Some went so far as to avoid bowel movements during holy days, thinking that open bodily functions might make them more spiritually exposed. As ridiculous as it all sounds now, this belief reveals something important about medieval culture: the intense anxiety around sin and the body. Everything was symbolic. The body wasn't just flesh and bone, it was a battleground for the soul. And every crevice, crack, and corner of that body had to be defended. To modern ears, the idea of clenching your cheeks to keep the devil out sounds like satire. But to a medieval villager, it was deadly serious. They weren't laughing, they were praying. Fear drove belief, and belief shaped behavior. In a way, this paranoia mirrors many contemporary fears. Today, we worry about cyber invasions or privacy breaches. Back then, they worried about demonic breaches of the most uncomfortable kind. So, the next time you read about medieval absurdities, remember that beneath every odd belief was a very real fear. Whether it was the uterus wandering or demons entering your butt, people were simply trying to make sense of the chaos around them. And sometimes, their answers, though bizarre, offer a fascinating glimpse into the depths of human imagination. Stay seated, stay safe, and keep those cheeks clenched. 20. Why the Middle Ages weren't actually dark, but still super dumb. When people hear the term Middle Ages, the image that often comes to mind is one of darkness, ignorance, disease, and societal decay. This idea has been perpetuated in modern media, textbooks, and even in casual conversations for centuries. But here's the twist: while the Middle Ages were undoubtedly filled with superstitions, bizarre beliefs, and a lack of scientific understanding, they weren't entirely dark. In fact, some progress was made during this era, though it's often overshadowed by the wildly ridiculous things people believed. To understand why the Middle Ages are branded as dark, we need to look at how the Renaissance thinkers, who came later, deliberately painted the preceding era in a negative light. They wanted to make their era appear as a grand rebirth of art, science, and reason after a long period of intellectual stagnation. This contrast helped justify their own accomplishments, but it also unfairly dismissed the cultural and intellectual contributions of the medieval world. During the Middle Ages, many significant institutions were born. Universities like Oxford and the University of Bologna were founded in the 11th and 12th centuries. These schools became centers for debate, theology, and eventually scientific inquiry. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving ancient manuscripts, keeping the works of Aristotle, Plato, and other great thinkers alive when the Western world had forgotten them. However, for every intellectual achievement, there was an equally absurd belief or practice. Medicine was a strange blend of astrology, religion, and pure nonsense. Physicians might diagnose a disease based on the alignment of the planets or prescribe treatments involving leeches, crushed emeralds, or even ingesting gold. Women were often excluded from academic life and labeled witches for displaying knowledge or independence. And let's not forget the bizarre belief that sneezing could expel demons, or that cats were minions of Satan, which led to mass cat killings, something that ironically worsened the Black Death. The contradiction of the Middle Ages lies in its dual identity. On one hand, it was a time of devotion, scholarship, and slow but steady progress. On the other, it was an age of laughably false medical advice, religious persecution, and widespread ignorance. For example, people believed that if you bathed too often, you would get sick, so they stayed dirty. They also thought mice were born spontaneously from hay, and that you could catch sin through your left hand. Each of these beliefs might sound ridiculous now, but back then, they were taken as truth by the majority. Despite these strange ideas, it's unfair to view the entire medieval period as a historical punchline. Many ideas that we now hold dear, like trial by jury, the concept of the university, and structured legal systems, have roots in this era. The Gothic cathedrals that still stand today required mind-blowing engineering. The illuminated manuscripts are works of art. The thinkers of this era were wrestling with immense philosophical and theological questions, often without the tools or data we have now. So, while yes, people thought the uterus could move around the body, and that demons could enter through your rear, these beliefs coexisted with the preservation of classical knowledge and the quiet building blocks of what would become the modern world. The term Dark Ages is a convenient label, but it ignores the nuance and complexity of this fascinating period. In conclusion, the Middle Ages weren't pitch black. They were more like a foggy twilight filled with bizarre shadows and unexpected flickers of genius. They were strange, yes, often hilariously so. But within that strangeness were the seeds of the Enlightenment and the foundations of Western civilization. So the next time you hear someone laugh about the dumb things people believed in the Middle Ages, remember, they also built universities, debated philosophy, and built cathedrals that still inspire awe today. That's not exactly stupid. Yet, no matter how much brilliance shone through the cracks, you can't deny the charm and sheer absurdity of a time when people feared witches would steal their milk, believed farting could cleanse the soul, or thought rubbing goose poop on your head would restore your hairline. That blend of earnest striving and epic misunderstanding is what makes the Middle Ages so wonderfully weird. And that's why they weren't entirely dark, but they sure were dumb. And thank God for that, because it makes for one heck of a story. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of one of the strangest journeys we've taken so far. We've wandered through the foggy alleyways of medieval thought, peeked into dusty manuscripts, heard tales of moon monsters and courtroom pigs, and we've stared history's weirdest moments straight in the face. It's tempting to laugh, isn't it? And don't worry, we should. Some of this stuff is so off the wall that it sounds like something straight out of a satire. A uterus that goes on road trips inside the body? Bat wings boiled for fertility? People being genuinely afraid of left-handed neighbors? You can't make this stuff up. Except, well, they kinda did. But here's the thing. These weren't dumb people. They weren't trying to be funny. In fact, many of them were the leading thinkers, priests, and physicians of their time. They were doing their best to make sense of a world they didn't understand, using the limited tools and information they had. And in that way, they're not so different from us. See, when we talk about dark times in history, we usually mean a lack of science, progress, or understanding. But what makes something truly dark isn't ignorance. It's fear. Fear of change. Fear of questions. Fear of being wrong. That's what leads to the kind of thinking where people believe cats are agents of the devil, or that rubbing goose droppings on your head will magically fix baldness. And when you look closely, fear is still with us today, just dressed differently, wrapped in better graphics, packaged with hashtags and high-speed Wi-Fi. So maybe that's why I love making videos like this. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror. A weird, warped mirror with goose poop on it. But a mirror nonetheless. It shows us how far we've come, and how far we still might go. Now, if you made it to the end of this 1-hour odyssey, you're a champion. A true member of the Strange Histories family. I know some parts were shocking, others hilarious, and a few probably made you say, "Wait, what did I just hear?" But that's the beauty of this corner of the internet. We celebrate the strange. We ask the odd questions. We shine light into history's forgotten closets and see what dusty stories tumble out. If this video entertained you, taught you something new, or even just made you laugh out loud at the absurdity of it all, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We've got dozens of tales just like this coming your way. Some even stranger. Some darker. Some just wonderfully human. Leave a comment below and tell me, which part shocked you the most? Was it the sky wolves? The sneeze demons? The medieval belief that bathing could literally kill you? I read every comment, and I love hearing your thoughts, your insights, and your laughter. This community makes these deep dives all the more worth it. So before you head to bed, turn down the volume and let the soft hum of your fan lull you to sleep. Take a moment to reflect. We are lucky. Lucky to live in an age where we can laugh at these things. Lucky to have science, reason, and maybe most importantly, Google. But let's also be humble, because just like them, we too believe things today that future generations might laugh at. That's the cycle. That's humanity. So stay curious. Keep asking weird questions. And never stop exploring the beautifully bizarre world that came before us. Thanks again for joining me tonight on Strange Histories. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay strange. Good night, wherever you are.